Welcome to our Facebook Live production here from NPR News. I'm Tom Weber. Yes, this is what I look like. And we're happy to have with us my two colleagues from the APM Research Lab. And if you were listening to the show that I host on NPR News, we did 3 shows last week about this big new survey that APM Research put out in the field, to use the jargon. And so now we're going to talk about it with 2 of the researchers who were part of that. They went through all the data. We had them on the show as well. And we know you have questions about how these data were brought together as well, and we have a few we're going to get to. Please submit a question in the comments below as we go through this. So Cassie Absar to my immediate right here, and Craig Helmstetter from the APM Research Lab. Let's just start with a general question, Craig, of what we were doing here with the survey. What's the point? Why did we do this?
Well, when I showed up here at American Public Media, the first thing I did was to meet with Nancy Cassett in the newsroom, your boss. And I said, well, we're starting up a research lab here, the APM Research Lab. How can we help? And she said, you know, in this post-election environment, we're really trying to understand what's on the minds of Minnesotans. So as we talked about it, we decided let's field a survey, a broad-ranging survey that really tries to get at a lot of different questions around what are on the minds of Minnesotans.
Yeah. And another quick question, Cassie, just on the nuts and bolts of it. Was 1,600, is that right? 1,600?
We had 1,600. We had a little more than 1,600. We
Yeah.
had 1,654 Minnesotans represented throughout the entire state.
And so one of the questions that came up, I actually asked this on the radio last week, but let's just go over it again here. The question is, you know, if you don't understand how surveys work, 1,600, there's 5 million people in the state of Minnesota. Is that enough, or is that too much? And what do we say to that?
Yeah, well, we listened back to that show, and you helped us answer the question.
Well, yes.
For those of you out on Facebook, you might not know that Tom Weber is a former mathlete.
That's right.
Right?
Well, once a mathlete, always a mathlete, Craig.
So,
I'm not a former anything in terms of mathletes.
Still a mathlete. And so you did a good job with this, but the basic idea is sort of, believe it or not, with surveys and statistics, you can represent almost any population with a sample size of 387 people. That'll get you within a margin of error of plus or minus 5% at the 95% confidence level to kind of get in there. And so obviously we have way more than 387, over 1,600 Minnesotans from across the state. So this is a pretty big survey.
So it's a big survey, and the math works. And Cassie, one of the tasks you had was to go through, as people did these surveys asking about all sorts of different things, and just give us a quick rundown of what people were asked about. They also had the chance to give open-ended answers, and you got to read through those. So explain that a little.
That's right. So the survey asked about numerous things. We asked about, religious attendance. We asked about trust in institutions, if they think they're on the right or wrong track over various issue areas. I mean, there are a plethora of questions. Approval for certain political leaders in the country, as well as Trump, President Trump. And so we also asked 5 open-ended questions. One on if you could change one thing in Minnesota, what would that be? And that, the highest things, the highest percentage of people were looking at the politics, like party politics, changing either, Democrats or Republicans, taxes, as well as social issues. And then we also asked about immigration, if we're on the right or wrong track, and why you chose one of those tracks. And we did the same thing for the economy, as well as I'm blinking. Healthcare, and then
schools and things like that.
Yeah, and then Trump approval.
Well, let's talk, because we talked on the show, Craig, about this last week, immigration and refugees. And the reason we talked about it on the show is there were some really interesting numbers. And the question had to do with, are we on the right track as a state in terms of welcoming immigrants and refugees?
Yep, we asked a number of those standard right track, wrong track questions, including do you think the state is on the right or wrong track when it comes to welcoming immigrants and refugees? So it's a kind of a broad question, trying to get at where people are at. And this one, interestingly, we were looking throughout the survey at where are there divides and where are there points of similarity among Minnesotans. Well, this question on immigration, it turns out to be there's a lot of divides around the state on how people are feeling about immigration.
By geography being one point there, Cassie, but also by your political affiliation. Here's one piece of data there on the screen there, the differences we see there between rural Minnesota and the Twin Cities metro is pretty stark.
And the political divide, I mean, this isn't up there, or
Yeah.
this, okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I
so
take
blue,
it-
so blue is the
There we go.
Democrats,
And-
obviously red
and you-
is the Republicans.
And you can see the political divide, and this same divide is seen with Trump approvers and disapprovers. So people who say they approve of the president as well as disapprove. It's a similar.
So one question, and this goes into how we actually put the survey together, and this is a question from Randall about why did you put legal immigration and undocumented immigration into the same question? I think his point was it would be interesting to see what people think about people who are immigrants but here illegally and those who are undocumented. Was there any thought on that when we were actually putting this whole survey together, making up the questions?
Well, we brainstormed with the newsroom a number of different questions. In the end, we had to keep it down to a 15-minute interview, so we weren't able to include everything. And definitely that might be something that would be interesting to ask. But we did ask this question: do we think we're on the right or wrong track when it comes to welcoming immigrants and refugees in our state? And then, as Cassie mentioned, we had a follow-up question where we asked people to talk about, you said that you thought we were on the wrong track. Why is that? And we just let them speak. And even though we didn't have an explicit question about undocumented or illegal immigrants, it didn't come up a lot in the open ends, or maybe hardly any at all, folks talking about undocumented immigrants. Is that right?
I mean,
Yeah.
I would say overall it came down to resources and how people feel about having people that they may consider outsiders in general being in their community as opposed to an undocumented or legal versus illegal split.
So again, if you have a question while you're watching us here live, just leave a question in the comments below us here, below the screen here on Facebook Live, and thanks for watching us here on NPR News on the Facebook page. And another question here, and I think we should, before I ask this question, Craig, I mean, and Cassie, the point here is this was our first time. And so I think you are looking for feedback, and maybe the next time we do this survey, it'll be different. Maybe there's a slightly different question to ask this time or that time. I presume you've gotten some feedback already on that.
Oh, yeah. We'd love to field another survey tomorrow to follow up on a lot of these questions, right?
So one question is, we talked about trust in institutions. So this one question from Margaret says, what about the judicial system and courts? There has been, in her opinion, a lot on the national level to undermine the credibility of the courts. Does that affect attitudes among Minnesotans? And so I guess to answer part of her question is that we didn't ask specifically about courts. Is that right, Cassie?
That's correct. I mean, but that is we did ask similar, we asked about law enforcement, as well as the state government in St. Paul. And so something that we want to do is keep in mind questions that'll be really important or really interesting for our next survey. And I think that's something we can do with this.
Trust in institutions was another big subset of this research. Talk about that a little bit.
So we asked, I guess we see the slide here on the screen. We asked about a number of institutions, and then you can see we asked them, can blank, this institution, always or mostly be trusted to do the right thing? And you can see there was a high amount of trust for the medical system, for law enforcement. Cassie just mentioned law enforcement. There's sort of a middle range there on organized religion and public schools. And then there's three areas we asked about where there's much less trust, and that's state government, big business, and the news media.
And we talked on the show, especially if you go, it's amazing. It's very interesting to see that police and law enforcement on that graph there in this survey. I mean, I guess the one way to say it is the most trusted institution of those we surveyed. But then when we got down and split up some of those results, Craig and Cassie, we found very different responses depending on where you live and other measurements.
Mm-hmm. Dan Crocker did a great story on this, on the trust in the news media. And then
Brant Williams did one about the police.
Yes, that was a very nice piece as well. The piece on the news media, he went to northern Minnesota, which was the area of the state that showed the least trust in the news media, and it was interesting to hear directly from some folks that he interviewed there, voicing a lot of skepticism about the news media.
How common was it, Cassie, when we talked, for example, you saw the graph there about law enforcement, high overall ratings, but then when you looked at it maybe by race or by geographic region, there were a lot of differences. How common was that in all the questions, or did we really pick out the 4 or 5 times when there were really these stark differences? You understand what I'm saying there?
So throughout the survey, where did
Yeah.
we see the most divide between either people of color and white Minnesotans, or?
Yeah.
Oh, that is. I
Or
mean,
by
we saw.
geography too, or I mean,
is a big question.
I guess the bigger question
It's a
is
very big
were there questions where everybody was universally basically saying the same thing, or were these regional divides, were these divides by race, big picture, present pretty regularly throughout the survey?
Healthcare.
Yeah, I was going to say the medical system.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of across the board
Yeah.
support. So I would think my response to that would be that I was looking at the so-called rural-urban divide and trying to see how common that was. And really, my takeaway was, while there are some serious divides, there are more similarities than there are divides. There, people in both parts of the state agreeing that the medical system, for example, is strong and trustworthy in our state. For better or worse, people may. There's also a lot of feeling that the state's doing a good job protecting our water supply, for example, and that was fairly consistent across the board. But there are those areas,
Right.
the news media, immigration, where people are pretty divided.
What did you learn about just being a Minnesotan, Cassie? What did you learn here about this state from this survey as you got to pour through and had to pour through all of these answers?
So I'm a new Minnesotan, and I've been doing international research before I came here. So this was really great for me, and I just learned that, Minnesota has a lot of varying opinions, but there are places where we can come together and we can have open discussions. And there are things within these issues, such as even the conversations we had on your show, considering police trust, that there are places where we can come together and have a civil discourse between different people and different groups. And so that was interesting.
This is a big picture of a project called Ground Level. This will be going on for a while, so this survey is just part of it. So what comes next? What's coming from Ground Level, and what comes maybe from the next survey? What have you already learned from this first survey?
Well, overall, out of the Ground Level as a project, I think there's going to be a ongoing series of discussions and dialogues for us at the APM Research Lab. We have this survey data. In many ways, I think we feel like we've just started. We've just scratched the surface. This thing is a gold mine of data and information that we can continue to analyze and help make sense out of what are on the minds of Minnesotans today.
And a question we got from Twitter along those lines is, now that you see the results of this survey, what question are you dying to ask that you didn't ask on the survey? Anything come to mind?
Oh, I feel like I have a list, and I'm trying to pull it out of my back pocket.
I have one while you're bullet fishing yours out. Our intention with this survey was to. Can we get this?
Let's do that.
Is to really represent. There we go.
Professional graphics. Here,
Professional
but look at that.
graphics. A nice map
So what
put
are we looking
together.
at? Obviously, that's a map of Minnesota.
This is a map of Minnesota, and we represented each of these different colored areas in our state. So we went through a lot of effort to make sure that every part of the state was adequately represented, which was great. We have great geographic coverage. For me, the next survey around, we're getting a lot of questions about how did people think about things by race and ethnicity. And in this survey, we're only barely able to answer those questions. We'd like to do an even more robust survey that gets into racial and ethnic similarities and differences across the state. That's one of my answers.
And I think that's actually, my list is about, okay, well, what does this group feel like? What does this race group feel over this, the whites are another, sorry to say the whites, but you know what I mean, white Minnesotans versus other racial groups. And I think that long list really does have to do with getting a representative sample of the racial breakdown in Minnesota.
Well, this has been a great wrap up here and a great survey. There's more information, and again, we're going to be doing more reporting, more shows about this in coming months. mprnews.org/ground level is the place to go. Cassie Absar and Craig Helmstetter from the APM Research Lab. They're going back into the lab. It's not a formal lab. We should
We got to
maybe
put our lab
We
coat
do
on.
have
gotta
lab
put that- We have
coats.
lab coats. So the research lab continues. We want to hear from you as well. To the point we had on Twitter, maybe there is a question, maybe there's a way to do a survey or a kind of survey in the future that you'd love to see. So leave a comment there in the comment section for this page, and there's contact information on the ground level page as well. So thank you all for joining us and being here, and thank you to our guests, and we'll see you later.